Evan Carlyle was born into a life that never required him to look down. From the nursery that overlooked the river to the high school perched in the mountains, someone else had always made sure the steps beneath him were steady. Drivers opened doors. Tutors slid worksheets across mahogany tables. Maids whisked away his mistakes while the city lights winked at him through glass that had never known his fingerprints. If the world were a stage, Evan had learned his marks young and never questioned who swept up after the show. At 19, he had a face made for magazine covers and a resume built from last names. His father, Victor Carlyle, had founded a logistics software empire that stitched ports, planes, and warehouses into a single unbroken map. Journalists called Victor a builder, a visionary, a force. To Evan, he was simply a schedule in a suit, precise, expensive, and hard to reach. On a warm Thursday evening in early May, the rooftop of Carlyle Tower trembled under the weight of 100 careless feet. LED tubes pulsed like the heartbeat of a robot. An infinity pool reflected a sky bruised from sunset to night. Music rolled from speakers tall as a grown man. A drone filmed laughter that wouldn't remember itself. At the center of it all stood Evan, holding a flute of something gold and sweet he didn't taste. A designer jacket hung loose from his shoulders. Sunglasses clung to the crown of his perfectly arranged hair, because on nights like that, the sun wasn't the only thing you wore protection from. He looked at his reflection in the sliding door, lifted his glass to the boy staring back, and mouthed, "Here's to never hearing no." Someone tossed an empty bottle over the glass railing. Another dared a second. The bottles became comets, bright for an instant, then gone. Sirens rose blocks away like a curtain call delivered early. The party ended not because anyone wanted it to, but because uniformed people with weary faces asked questions no one felt like answering. Lawyers appeared. Explanations softened. Phone cameras lowered. Checks were promised. In the elevator down, Evan's laughter echoed as if the building itself were bored with him. He slept late the next day, woke to messages salted with gossip, and wandered through his penthouse without noticing the fresh flowers, or the folded shirts, or the way the cleaning staff made the rugs agree with the furniture. Around noon, his phone lit with a calendar invite from an address he never ignored. V. Carlyle, Office. The subject line was plain. Stop by. The receptionist on the 53rd floor didn't make eye contact when Evan arrived. His father's assistant, a woman who could orchestrate a summit with 3 calls and a sigh, barely nodded. Evan registered these things the way a swimmer registers temperature enough to notice, not enough to matter. Victor stood at the wall of glass that overlooked the river. He didn't turn when the door whispered shut. "You think this is a playground," he said. His voice wasn't raised. It never needed to be. Evan leaned against a leather chair. "It was a party." "You're a headline away from becoming a cautionary tale," Victor said, hands in his pockets. "You disgrace my name. Worse, you waste what you've been given." "You were born rich," Evan said, a smirk tugging. "Don't start with the bootstrap story. Nobody builds railroads anymore," Victor faced him then. The lines around his mouth were cut deeper than Evan remembered. "You've never asked where I came from," he said, "because you've never thought it mattered." Silence spread between them, cool as the room. "So what?" Evan shrugged. "You want me to put on a tie and fetch your coffee? Learn how to say synergy?" He laughed at his own joke. Victor's eyes didn't change. "No. I want you to understand what happens next. Another scandal with your name attached, and you're out. No trust. No stock. No penthouse. No last name you can spend like a card. You're bluffing, Evan said. But the words didn't carry heat. Victor returned to the window. Ask yourself why I felt the need to say it out loud. Evan left without slamming the door. He went home, watched the city flicker from his balcony, and turned his phone face down. Fear visited briefly, like a draft through a sealed room, but the walls held. By Sunday, he was leaning against his orange coupe in a faculty spot at Lakeview University, as if nothing had shifted at all. He walked through the student union with the bored grace of someone used to space widening around him. He ignored the signs about sustainability and mental health and new dining options. Then, in the cafeteria, he clapped eyes on a small accident. A tray flipped, soup holding a new geography on the tile. A banana surrendering beneath someone's shoe. An older man in a faded uniform knelt with a rag, and a calm that did not belong to spills. His hair was mostly gray. His hands looked like they had learned a long time ago that work doesn't ask how you're feeling. Evan kicked the tray farther. You dropped something, Grandpa? The man didn't look up. He kept wiping, a slow, careful circle. Evan laughed and moved on, already bored. By Tuesday, a subject line in his inbox interrupted the rhythm of his day. Mandatory conduct hearing. Immediate attendance required. Hearing, not meeting. Evan walked into a conference room wearing his practiced grin and a shirt that suggested this interruption was the interesting part of his afternoon. He stopped when he saw his father at the end of the table. Dean Martinez sat with a folder open. The program director had a tablet. A student judiciary representative tapped a pen against a legal pad. Victor Carlisle's jaw was a straight line. We have videos, Dean Martinez said evenly. Verbal harassment, provocation, a pattern. It was a joke, Evan said. He dropped his tray. I made a comment. Everyone's very sensitive. Shut your mouth, Victor said. The room held its breath. After a moment, the dean slid a paper toward Evan. You can accept a suspension, she said, or you can complete a period of community service under the supervision of the staff member you harassed, Mr. Isaiah Brooks. Service? Evan scoffed. Like sweeping? Like learning, the dean answered. Decide now. Victor didn't speak. He didn't need to. Evan picked up a pen and signed. The maintenance building lived on the side of campus most students walked past without seeing. Inside, the air smelled like metal and lemon cleaner. Racks held mops with the patience of monks. A small radio in the corner dared anyone to change its station. A man stood at a workbench, sorting bolts into plastic bins. Up close, the gray at his temples looked more like silver. He wore his uniform with a dignity that didn't need starch. Mr. Brooks? Evan said, trying out a grin that had diffused 1,000 middling conflicts. Isaiah Brooks turned his head, then his body. His eyes were steady but not cold. You're late. It's 2 minutes, Evan said. It's a beginning, Isaiah replied. He handed Evan a broom. East Courtyard. No phone, no earbuds, no talking. He pointed at a time clock. Punch out when you're done. Evan stared. You think you can order me? Isaiah's gaze didn't shift. Out there, he said, nodding toward the world beyond the door. You can be whoever you like. In here, we work. The sun was behaving like it had something to prove. Dust rose and settled on the stones the way the sea keeps trying. Evan's hands learned slowly that a broom has its own language. He leaned too hard, then too soft, He scratched lines into the day. Sweat found paths across his shirt that cologne couldn't censor. Students moved through the courtyard in clumps. No one filmed. No one applauded. No one sneered. They simply moved around him, the way everyone moves around what they're used to ignoring. Isaiah watched from the shade of a maple. He didn't correct. He didn't scold. He didn't offer water. He was there, and somehow that felt like both pressure and relief. By the third day, Evan arrived 15 minutes late and hung over from nothing in particular. He expected Isaiah to be waiting with a speech. Instead, the man stood with his back to the door, organizing a shelf of cleaners like a librarian reshelving returns. "Today," Isaiah said without turning, "gym bathrooms." "You're kidding," Evan said. "Scrub brushes are in the blue bin," Isaiah said. "Disinfectant is labeled. Wear gloves. Masks are on the hook." The smell in the tiled room slapped him. He gagged, then swore, which made him feel 12. He made a show of scrubbing one sink, just enough to say he'd started. He paused often. When he looked up, Isaiah stood in the doorway, arms folded, not unkind. "This isn't my job," Evan said. Isaiah leaned against the frame. "It's work." "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean," Isaiah said. "What you mean is you don't think this is for you." He paused, letting the words rest where they fell. "But today it is." Evan opened his mouth, then shut it. He lowered his head and began to scrub like the sink had done something personal to him. Later, when the gloves came off, his hands were red in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. Back in his penthouse that night, he lay on the couch and stared at them. He didn't go out. On the fifth morning, he arrived on time in a plain t-shirt and old sneakers bought to look vintage, now earning their cost. He nodded to Isaiah without performing. The man nodded back. It felt like a truce or the beginning of one. They raked leaves from corners the wind preferred. They watered beds where someone with a much smaller budget had coaxed beauty into a plan. They swept stone paths that would be dusty again by afternoon. "You ever notice," Isaiah said as they sat on the edge of a planter, sharing the kind of water that tastes like a reward, "that the people who work the hardest are the least visible?" Evan rested the rake across his lap. "I never thought about it," he said, then heard himself and added, "That's the problem." Isaiah's mouth tilted. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. He stood. Back at it. They worked the afternoon in a silence that wasn't empty. When the clock allowed, Isaiah walked Evan into the campus library, a place Evan had visited mostly as a backdrop for photos. "We start in the back," Isaiah said, his voice naturally lower here, "where the forgotten books live." "Rescuing the forgotten." Evan grinned, surprised to hear the sentence leave his own mouth. They wiped down shelves that had made peace with dust. Evan read spines like a map he hadn't learned in school. His hand paused over a battered copy of Invisible Man. He pulled it out. "That one hits hard," Isaiah said without turning. "You might try it." Evan slid the book into his backpack. Later, under the unkind light of his kitchen, he opened it. He read until the windows noticed the sky lightening. Days stacked themselves. Not all were revelations. There were filters so clogged they coughed gray ghosts. There were chairs that clicked into usefulness with a quarter turn of a screw. There were light bulbs that surrendered with a final spark and accepted replacements with a small, dignified glow. One Friday, when the calendar gave most students a long weekend, Evan showed up anyway. Isaiah stood with a clipboard in the doorway of the maintenance shop. "Silent maintenance," he said. "Work that keeps everything running without asking for thanks." They stood on the stage of the main auditorium and looked out at 2,000 empty seats. Evan felt a strange steadiness, like standing in a church when no one else is there. "I used to think I'd be up here for something," he said. Isaiah cinched a bolt tighter beneath a seat. "Maybe you will," he said. "Maybe this is how you practice." They moved through the humanities building, where the hallways smelled faintly of chalk, although no teacher had used it in years. Isaiah paused near a small reading room whose window looked over a line of elms. Unlike everything else, no one had asked him to fix this room. He went anyway. Evan followed, stopping at the threshold. Isaiah sat in a worn leather chair with his back to the light and opened a book. The room looked like it had been waiting for one person for a long time. "You come here often?" Evan said, instantly hating the clumsy words. "When I need to remember who I am," Isaiah said. Evan glanced at the books stacked like patient friends. "Were you a teacher?" he asked, suddenly sure. Isaiah closed the book gently. "Once." "What happened?" Isaiah stared at the window long enough that Evan wondered if the question had been a mistake. Then he reached into the old satchel he carried and handed Evan a photograph. It showed a younger Isaiah surrounded by kids in a church basement crowded with books. "I ran a literacy program," he said. "Then I taught. 2 universities." He said it like you'd say I once lived on a street with a nice maple, not as a claim to anything. "And now you're here," Evan said softly. "Now I'm here," Isaiah said. He took the photo back and slid it into the bag, like a page returned to a book at a precise line. That night, Evan read The Fire Next Time. He did not post a quote online. He didn't underline. He read slowly, like a person learning how to listen. On Monday, Isaiah led him down a narrow set of stairs behind the maintenance shop. The air cooled and grew heavy. Pipes ran like careful veins across the ceiling. He handed Evan gloves and a face mask. "Filters today," he said. "The air's only invisible until it isn't." They pried open grills and pulled out mats of dust that looked like the campus's unacknowledged history. They coughed into their masks. Evan swore a little. Isaiah laughed once, not at him, but at something shared the ridiculousness and the necessity of labor. After they washed, Isaiah unlocked a narrow room in the back of the basement and turned on a single humming bulb. He withdrew a cardboard box from a cabinet. Diplomas with seals that had once rung like bells, program flyers yellowed at the edges, letters on letterhead that had impressed somebody once. At the bottom lay a newspaper clipping and a photocopied police report. "Who was he?" Evan asked, pointing to a framed picture of a young man in a cap and gown, with a smile that looked ready to lead a parade. "Malcolm," Isaiah said. The name arrived warm. "My student." He came from a block where people counted their successes in Saturdays. He earned Yale. He had a way of looking at you that made you want to be the person he seemed to see. "What happened?" Evan asked, though a weight in his stomach already knew it must be something that would make him angry. "A drunk driver left a party," Isaiah said. "Hit him in the crosswalk." The boy's father was a judge. "It was a tragedy," he said, as if he were quoting a word someone else had insisted on. The photocopy told the rest in the voice of bureaucracy. Obstruction of justice. Unstable. Unfit. The system pulled a thread until Isaiah's career came apart in its hands. Evan didn't speak for a long time. The air was still. He understood suddenly that there are rooms in every life where the weather never changes. Back on the surface, the world went on, students talking about internships, about shows, about nothing. Evan saw them differently. He also saw the workers entering through the back gate at dusk, a line of invisible people carrying the day's weight out of sight. He wrote that night. It didn't matter whether he'd ever show anyone what spilled from his fingers. What mattered was the impulse to tell the truth and the understanding that truth cost people more than words. Victor Carlyle had built a life designed to prevent surprises. He signed contracts that punished uncertainty out of existence. He organized people the way a chess player arranges pieces, each in its best position for a game only he could see. Then he received a call from the dean and discovered his son had been scrubbing toilets under the supervision of a janitor. He arrived unannounced. He had stopped announcing himself years ago because doors had learned to open before he knocked. He found Evan in a gray work shirt, paint on his hands, and a serenity Victor didn't recognize, which irritated him more than paint on his son's hands. "You've been working as a janitor?" he demanded. "With one," Evan said. "It's different." "Do you think this is noble? Playing poor?" Victor glanced toward the man standing by the door, gloves tucked into his belt. "And you, who exactly are you?" "Isaiah Brooks," the man said. "I've been supervising your son." Victor looked at the dean. "This ends now." "He completed the program with maturity," the dean said, as if maturity could be measured in hours. Victor did not roll his eyes, but he wanted to. "It doesn't end," Evan said. "I'm not done." Victor opened his mouth and found nothing useful in it. He left feeling as if someone had rearranged the furniture in a room he'd memorized in the dark. The next afternoon, he returned to the campus alone. He found Isaiah mopping a hallway that smelled faintly of ammonia and young people. They sat on a bench under a tree that had watched better conversations than most people knew. Victor stared at his hands. "I came from Detroit," he said, surprising himself with the impulse to narrate aloud. "My mother cleaned houses. Winters were a strategy. I ate school lunches and learned you could assemble a life from whatever was on the tray if you didn't waste time wishing it were different. I swore my son would never feel cold," he paused. "I might have removed not just the cold, but the weather. I built him a world without seasons." Isaiah listened the way a carpenter listens to a wall, attentive to what might be bearing weight. "You gave him everything but resistance," he said gently. "What does a father do with that?" "Walk beside him," Isaiah said. "Not ahead. Not behind." They were quiet long enough that the wind decided it could be heard. Victor looked at the side of Isaiah's face. "Do you miss teaching?" "Every day," Isaiah said. "But I do it anyway." "The classroom looks different. What would it take to build a program?" Victor asked, the old blueprints unfurling in his head without permission. "For kids like your Malcolm. Tutors, books, a space that belongs to them. No press releases." Isaiah turned. "What would it take for you to let it exist without putting your name on it?" Victor smiled, the involuntary kind. "Touché." They shook hands. It wasn't a contract. It felt larger. Evan saw his father leaving from across the courtyard and didn't call out. They traded a small nod that carried more freight than louder gestures. The Renovo project launched in a campus auditorium that had been cleaned more often than it had been filled. No celebrity MC, no step and repeat. A banner hung above the stage. Renovo, wisdom from the ground up. Isaiah stood in a blue shirt and shoes he had shined himself. He didn't need a teleprompter because he didn't plan to say anything he didn't already believe. "I was a professor," he began. "Then I was something else. What I learned in between is that dignity can be misplaced and recovered, not by speeches, but by work and by being seen." Evan sat in the third row and felt his chest tighten in a way that wasn't fear. Students who had laughed at him earlier that semester now looked at him with a different math in their eyes. At the very back, Victor stood without moving, like a witness. The applause at the end started politely and became something real. Evan stayed behind to fold chairs with Isaiah. He didn't realize Victor had left until he found a small note tucked under a coil of extension cord. "Proud of what's beginning." He didn't keep the penthouse much longer. He moved into an apartment near campus where the floors creaked honestly. He kept a few clothes and a stack of books that made him feel like a better version of himself. He tutored at the Renovo project 3 afternoons a week. He learned the shape of other people's sentences. He learned that patience is faster than hurry. Isaiah taught literature again, then writing, then something larger than both. Word spread. His evening classes filled with students whose transcripts suggested their stories would end quietly. Isaiah taught them to argue with their own sentences until the truth appeared. On a Sunday walk along the river after the first snow, Evan asked, "Do you think people really change?" "Sometimes," Isaiah said. "The ones who can stand to look at themselves." "Did I?" "You're changing," Isaiah said. "That counts." They stopped on the bridge where the lights always looked like a second city trapped in the water. Evan thought of the boy who had kicked a tray and the man who had picked it up. He looked down at his own hands, which were no longer soft. He thought of Victor, who had learned how to give without claiming. He didn't know whether he would run his father's company one day or write a book no one expected him to write or teach in a classroom that smelled like chalk again. He only knew the ground beneath him felt steadier when he knew who had built it. The call came on a weekday morning in early spring. A pipe had burst in the basement beneath the reading room Isaiah loved. Water had found the easiest path through the university's veins. By the time they arrived, the room was ankle deep. Isaiah handed Evan a push broom and waded in. They worked side by side, moving water toward a door that liked to stick. The custodian crew arrived, and without needing to be organized, everyone found a task. When they had done what they could, Isaiah knelt and picked up a stack of books that had soaked through. He separated them one by one, as if dignity could be salvaged in the right light. "You okay?" Evan asked. Isaiah nodded. "Everything is always breaking," he said. "The job is not to be surprised." They carried the books to a sunny windowsill upstairs and set them like living things that needed warmth. Isaiah stood a long time, hands on the sill, face in the light. "Do you ever regret staying?" Evan asked quietly. "Here." After everything Isaiah thought. "No," he said finally. "Leaving isn't the only way to move on. Sometimes you stay until the story changes." "Whose story?" Evan said. Isaiah's smile crept up slowly. "All of ours." That afternoon, Renovo tutors met under the only non-leaking part of the roof. Kids from 3 neighborhoods showed up carrying heavy backpacks and lighter faces. Evan watched a 7th grader named Dante discover he could make a paragraph bend to his will. He watched a quiet girl named Jania read aloud without her voice shaking by the 2nd page. He watched Isaiah float, present and invisible in the way that good teachers learn to be, stepping in only when a flame needs air. Victor appeared once, sitting at the back, hands folded like a parishioner. He caught Evan's eye and mouthed, "Proud." Again, as if the word were a practice, not a flourish. A year later, they gathered again in the auditorium, this time for a Renovo showcase. No decoration except a projection on the back wall. Work you can hear. Students read essays with the kind of courage that comes from being told the truth about your own voice. Parents cried the way people cry when a door that had always been locked opens without fanfare. When it was over, when the chairs were already halfway folded, and the lights had remembered they could dim, Isaiah leaned on the stage and watched Evan talk to a small circle of donors. Victor stood at a distance, careful not to let his presence change the chemistry. Isaiah noticed with private satisfaction that Evan didn't sell the project. He didn't promise miracles. He described work. Evan crossed the room later and sat next to Isaiah on the edge of the stage. "You know," Evan said, tapping his heel gently against the wood, "I had this idea back then that life would be impressive if I stood on stages. Now I think it's impressive if the floor doesn't wobble." Isaiah laughed softly. "If you only knew how many screws I've tightened in this place." "I do," Evan said. "I was there." Isaiah tilted his head, thinking of the basement and the filters and the books drying like rescued sparrows. "You were." They sat in easy silence, two men a decade apart in age and a lifetime apart in beginnings, listening to the building settle. There are lessons that declare themselves in slogans, and there are lessons that arrive slowly, like calluses. Evans arrived the second way. He began to notice the people who held up his days. The barista who remembered he liked his coffee too hot. The shuttle driver who waited an extra beat in the rain. The woman in facilities who hid a joke in every work order ticket for anyone who bothered to read them. He learned their names the way a person learns the geography of a home. Carefully. Gratefully. When Victor asked him to sit in on a meeting about a new software acquisition, Evan said yes. He wore a suit that looked less like a costume than it used to. He took notes and didn't speak until he was sure silence would be more rude than the opinion he was forming. He didn't tell his father at dinner later. He didn't post a screenshot of the boardroom. He did call Isaiah to ask a question about how to explain a decision to people at the bottom of the organization chart. "Explain the why," Isaiah said. "Then ask them if you missed anything. And mean it when you ask, 'I'll try,'" Evan said. "You'll do," Isaiah said. On a late summer afternoon, they returned to the courtyard, where Evan had first held a broom wrong. Students walked the stone paths with backpacks full of ambitions and snacks. A fountain tried its best. The oldest maple threw good shade. "Tell me a story about Malcolm I don't know yet," Evan said. Isaiah smiled in a way that meant he would. "He was bad at public speaking," he said. "Hands shook, voice broke. So we made a deal. He could use the podium as long as he never gripped it like a lifeboat. He learned to let his hands rest. By his senior year, he didn't need the podium. He made the room his Evan watched a group of freshmen laugh at a joke they'd already forgotten. People should know his name," he said. "They will," Isaiah said, "because you remember." They sat until the shadows decided they were brave enough to grow. The great danger in stories like this is to end them with a trumpet. Lives don't do that. They continue. They get coffee the next morning. They fix small leaks in big buildings. They raise money without promising more than work can deliver. They forgive themselves for who they were. They practice being better where they are. But if an ending is required, let it be this. Evan visited his father's office one evening when the hallways were quiet enough to hear the polishing machine far away. He stood in the doorway. Victor looked up from a spreadsheet and smiled in a way that loosened Evan's chest. "Walk?" Evan asked. They left the tower without drivers to cushion the moment. They crossed the bridge where the river pretends it is in charge of the city. They did not talk business. They did not talk about the past as if it were a prosecution. They talked about what they were reading. They talked about how a good pair of shoes matters more the older you get. They remembered Evan's mother and her recipe for Sunday chicken that always tasted like rest. Halfway across the bridge, they stopped and leaned on the rail as the water shuffled underneath. "I thought my job was to remove every obstacle from your path," Victor said. "Turns out my job is to make sure the path is real." "It is," Evan said. "Now." They stood there, two men who had given each other grief and gifts, letting the city be louder than their thoughts for once. Back on campus the next day, Isaiah arrived before the sun and unlocked the door to the maintenance shop. He hung his satchel on its hook, punched the clock not because anyone checked, but because ritual matters, and wrote the day's list on the whiteboard in a hand that made other people write better when they tried to copy it. Evan walked in a few minutes later, carrying a box of new work gloves. He set it on the bench and grinned. "What's first?" he asked. Isaiah looked at the list. "Filters," he said. "Again." "Good," Evan said. "I like breathing." They descended into the basement together. The air was cool on their faces. Somewhere above them, the auditorium waited, and the lecture halls, and the small reading room with the leather chair that would always smell faintly like summer. Somewhere beyond that, the Renovo kids would arrive after school with essays that needed turning and stories that needed witnesses. Work hummed. The day held. The floor did what floors do. It bore the weight without needing applause. And the men who had learned to look down and see it went on, step by step, not toward a spotlight, but toward the quiet, central thing that keeps a life from wobbling. Maybe the measure of a life isn't how high we climb, but how gently we walk on the floor someone else built. Evan learned to look down with gratitude. Victor learned to walk beside, not ahead. And Isaiah reminded us that dignity is not a title. It's a way of showing up when no one is clapping. If we can see the invisible hands that hold our days together, we become better neighbors, better parents, better souls. Who taught you a lesson you still carry? A custodian, a teacher, a nurse, a grandparent? Write their name and what they taught you in the comments so we can honor them here. If this story moved you, please subscribe and turn on the bell. It costs nothing, but it helps these quiet heroes be seen. Share this video with a friend who might need a gentle nudge toward grace. Until next time, keep your hands open and your heart teachable.